Dr. Edward Omar Moad's latest book, Coherence of the Incoherence, has generated a huge debate among scholars of Islam and philosophy. In this latest book, he tries to understand the perceived conflict between Islam, science, and reason through the eyes of three great Islamic philosophers. Today, he joins us online from Qatar. Welcome to The Matrix. Dr. Edward Omar Moad's book, Coherence of the Incoherence, focuses on the famous discourses of Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, the three great Muslim thinkers. The arguments brought out in this book are meaningful and relevant for finding solutions Muslim world faces today. Dr. Edward teaches philosophy in the Qatar University. Welcome, Dr. Edward.
Thank you for having me again. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
So, Professor Edward, before we go into details of your book, could you, for the interest of our viewers, tell us about your background, your academic background, and where you come from?
Well, I'm originally from the United States. I grew up in a Christian family and became, I guess, agnostic in the teenage years. And I studied philosophy. I got my bachelor's in philosophy. And at that time, I became quite skeptical. And later, I read a translation of the Quran and converted to Islam and went on to graduate school in philosophy at the University of Missouri. At that time, because of converting and having been already in philosophy, I had, as you can expect, to sort of maybe ambiguous relationship with philosophy at the time, right? But I went ahead and pursued the graduate studies anyway. And at that time, during that time, I discovered Al-Ghazali, and that sort of started my interest in Islamic philosophy more broadly. And after that, I got my PhD. I went to Singapore for a few years as a research fellow, and ended up eventually in Qatar University, where I've been the last 16 years teaching philosophy here, and a philosophy minor program.
Wonderful. Professor Edward, Imam Ghazali and Ibn Rushd are two great Muslim thinkers you've studied in great detail. Both of them have their discourses on Islam and Western philosophy. What can you tell us about the sticking points? And is there a way forward for Muslims to reconcile the conflicts in the postmodern world?
Well, the first thing I thought when I read the question was that I would say Ghazali and Ibn Rushd were not at all dealing with Western philosophy, because at their time there was no such thing as Western philosophy. So they were engaging with ancient Greek philosophy from Plato and Aristotle, and from their commentators, and then those among the Muslims who also were influenced by those philosophies, including Ibn Rushd, obviously, and then before that, Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina and the whole list. Right? So this is not Western philosophy, though. They would not have thought of it as Western philosophy. And if you had asked Ghazali about Western philosophy, he probably, Ibn Rushd wasn't there, but the only person that you could really say meaningfully was a Western philosopher would be Ibn Rushd, because he lived in the West, right, which is right over there in Morocco. Yeah. So the West is something which has been constructed, much more recently, as a result of the Europeans. Many people say, and I tend to agree, the Europeans sort of joining forces against the threat of the Ottomans and the Muslims, and so they started to think of themselves as the West. And when you arrive at the Enlightenment, you have a self-conception of the Enlightenment thinkers as Western and as the sort of true inheritors of the Greek, tradition and the inheritance of Plato and Aristotle. So, if we Muslims actually, and if anybody in the world, actually speaks of, for example, Ghazali and Ibn Rushd engaging with Western philosophy, and speaks of Plato and Aristotle as Western philosophers, we're simply buying into that construct that is really the West's own self-conception. And then I would consider that to be sort of a colonized conception of philosophy generally. Yeah. And therefore, yeah, and they were definitely engaging with, Plato and Aristotle.
Yes,
And the
SPA,
Plato and
as we
Aristotle
call
they were
them.
engaging with is not
Sophocles,
necessarily the one
Plato,
that
and
the Westerners.
Aristotle. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So the second part of your question was, I'm sorry,
What can you tell us about the differences they had in their discourses?
Okay, the difference between the two.
Yes.
Between the two, right. It's very interesting, actually. So the differences between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd on at least the very controversial and oftentimes the most popularly interesting topic, which was about causality and natural causality and miracles. Yeah. That difference really actually can be traced to a difference between Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, right? So the question here is whether natural laws or law-like facts about nature can be ascertained directly from experience, or whether it requires a metaphysical premise, right? So the original, or Ibn Rushd would certainly say the original Aristotelian view is that these kind of natural laws, if you want to put it that way, can be ascertained directly through observation, right? On the other hand, the Islamic philosophers had already, by the time of Al-Farabi, I think, encountered what we now call the problem of induction. And that simply is the problem that, observation can only afford us experience of a limited number of cases, whereas a natural law or a universal truth that we want to get out as a scientific matter, cannot be supported by any, limited observation like that, right? And so the solution for Ibn Sina was to, assert that there's a kind of a metaphysical premise in the background, right? Kind of causal premise, yeah, which we use then on the basis, on that basis, we conclude, we arrive at our universal truths that we want from science. So actually, this was very useful for Ghazali, in his argument that basically no amount of experience or observation could establish the impossibility of certain miracles that he was, concerned with, right? And so Ibn Rushd, right, for that reason also, seeing that threat, opposed Ibn Sina, and he took the view that we need not employ a metaphysical premise to arrive at universal truths on the basis of a limited number of observations, but rather we can actually arrive at these universal truths directly through the observations or from the observations. A little bit complicated there, but you asked for some example of the point of conflict, right?
Yes.
And the point here is that the point of conflict is really not one that's been oversimplified in the modern kind of polemic. It's not really just about faith versus reason. It's really about different theories, right? About how scientific knowledge is arrived at, and about, what causality is, yeah. And these are actually different philosophical theories, right? Differences which really are alive, today, in fact. Ironically, I think, and some people have pointed this out, you could argue that Ghazali, who has been, sort of construed as the theologian who is anti-science and sort of anti-reason, right? Well, his actual epistemology of natural science, if you put it that way, more closely resembles like modern and contemporary philosophers of science when it comes to induction and, what natural scientific knowledge consists in, right? Whereas Ibn Rushd's view, which really is more close to Aristotle's, is very different from that of modern philosophers of science. So we end up with a little bit of some tension when we talk about this in terms of the Western, the Muslim, relation with the West. Right? Right.
So yes, you have brought out some very fresh perspectives about the way we think about these philosophers, the traditional, viewpoint, and what you've brought out in your book is quite surprising. Now, to understand from you, Dr. Edward, that how do we make sense of uh, the discourses in the postmodern world? Ibn Rushd, Al-Ghazali, and of course Ibn Sina.
Yeah, that's a not quite an easy question for me to answer because I haven't thought about this in relation to postmodernism. Yeah. So I have to deploy my understanding of what postmodern means. And to me, it's always meant a kind of critique of the modernist, presumption or pretension, perhaps, of being, having a uniquely rational epistemological basis, right? Historically and geographically unique. That's the idea that, the West and Western science and Western philosophy and Western culture is uniquely privileged because it, is alone among other cultures based on reason, whereas the other cultures are all based on some kind of arbitrary superstition or cultural, right,
Right.
outlook. Yeah. So the postmodernists, critique this and tend to show or try to argue that the West is also just one among another arbitrary points of view, right? And it would seem to be that the ultimate conclusion is that, right, there are nothing but arbitrary perspectives. There is no sort of meta narrative, right, which we can, on the basis of which we can judge between the various different cultural outlooks. Yeah, if we want to put it
Yes.
that way. Yeah, and I think that that's quite different from either any of the parties in this debate, because none of the parties in this debate would accept the idea that there is no objective truth possible, right?
Mhm.
Ibn Sina and Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd are all engaged in a debate which is premised on the possibility of objective proof, and it's actually premised on the possibility of reason to arrive at that, right?
Mhm.
Now, the role of revelation and scripture is a question which they may differ on, right? But not probably in the way that Westerners would think of that difference because of the Western experience. It's actually a unique conversation, right? And part of what we need to do when we look at our own tradition is to see the uniqueness of this conversation and not to construe it through the Western gaze and not to understand what that issue meant for them in the same way that it means for Westerners, as if that was a universal understanding. Okay? So in a sense, there's a kind of a, a resonance with postmodern concerns here in the sense that we are definitely, it is a matter of critiquing Western claims to unique objectivity, right? But
Mhm.
it's not, I don't think it is constructive to also agree with the postmodernists' more global claim that there is no such objectivity possible at all, right? So sometimes some of the observations and insights of postmodern thinkers, right? For example, as I just mentioned, the historicity of the concept of the West, right? And the idea that the West is a concept of self-conception that, was constructed at a certain time in history and then which, used or incorporated the Greek heritage into their self-conception.
Mhm.
Looking at things historically in this way, which previously had not been seen historically, is a postmodern method, right? Or it's a method that they use.
Mhm.
But using that method to uncover these, false claims of objectivity or universality does not necessarily entail denying the possibility of objectivity altogether. Right? So there are no postmodern thinkers really, I think, in the in the Islamic tradition, or at least these three are definitely not postmodernists. And
Okay.
so
Yes.
I guess the usefulness of looking at this tradition is that Muslims would be able to actually resist um, Western hegemony and the colonialism and the intellectual colonialism that is, involved in that without giving up their own truths, without giving up the notion of knowledge and truth and objectivity altogether. Right? So you need not be a postmodernist, you know what I mean, in order to resist modernity, basically.
Right. So, your book delves into the conflict between Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali as far as science, religion, and philosophy are concerned. I mean, the discourses. What is the relevance of this debate in the world we live in? How do we make it relevant in the times we live in?
Right. Well, definitely it's relevant, given that we live in a context where there's a certain construal of the relation between what we call religion and science, which is taken as given.
Mhm.
It's taken as given to the degree that, it's almost implicit. And, people carry on discussions as if that construal of the relation and so-called conflict were, a basic a fact that need not and cannot be, questioned. Yeah. And so therefore, Muslims also in this kind of dominant discourse, usually we live in countries and in a system which is dominated by this paradigm. We end up, thinking, well, discussing first, and then as a consequence of that, thinking according to that paradigm, right?
Mhm.
If we can actually look closely in the details of a historical Muslim discussion, right, about the relation between wisdom and the religious principles of Islam, right, we can see how that discussion had taken place in a very different way, and we can understand that relation in a different way, right, in a
Mhm.
way which is not just the Western experience superimposed. Yeah.
Mhm.
And part of what I want to do in this book is to explain in detail enough this discussion, between Ghazali and Ibn Rushd that we can find in these two books, The Incoherence of the Philosophers and The Incoherence of the Incoherence. In enough detail to look at it in enough detail to see its uniqueness, right, and avoid the version of that which is simply just the result of imposing Western presumptions and presuppositions about the relation between religion and science or philosophy onto that event.
Mhm.
It's a way to understand ourselves through our own eyes or the eyes of our predecessors in Islam rather than through Orientalist eyes, basically.
Sure. So, Imam Al-Ghazali, you say in your book, is often misunderstood and as being someone who disliked science and reason, and that he
Yeah.
preferred religion over the rest. Interestingly, you state that he was against the literal interpretation of Kalam and even in Islamic books, from Islamic books. What can we learn from his accommodative approach, which you have tried to understand to make Islam relevant today?
Mhm. Um, well, I don't recall ever saying that Ghazali was against the literalist interpretation of Kalam, and I'm not really sure actually what that would mean. Um, uh, so yeah, that question's a little bit hard for me. So for that reason, yeah. What do you mean by the literal interpretation of Kalam?
Means that he was not a stickler of the Kalam, the verses or the text which was there, but he was for the interpretation which meant which was meaningful in the times he was living. So he,
Okay.
yes.
Um, so when it comes to interpretation, it doesn't seem to me like that the texts of Kalam are the thing that we're talking about there, but rather it's really the Quran and Hadith. So
Yes.
uh, what I can think of here is the fact, which is a fact, that Ghazali, in the Incoherence of the Philosophers in the preface, right?
Mhm.
At least there and probably in other places. But anyway, he takes the view that if something from the rational sciences is demonstrably proven, right?
Mhm.
And then we have a text from the Quran or Hadith which appears to contradict that thing,
Right.
right? Then we should be metaphorically interpreting the text,
Absolutely.
right?
Yes.
Because if something is demonstratively proven, then right, there's no doubt about it, and there's no real way, truthfully, to oppose it, right, or to deny
Right.
it. Yeah. Now his standards for demonstrative proof are quite high, right? And they are basically, very similar to the philosopher standard demonstrative proof. In fact, they're essentially the same. Yeah. Um, and and those standards are much higher than what our contemporary proponents of maybe scientism would have, right? So, but they did differ, obviously, on these particular things with regard to miracles, right? So the question here is, do we have knowledge about the nature of things, which is demonstrative enough, right,
Yes.
to force us to believe or to preclude the possibility of, for example, the Prophet Abraham being immersed in the fire without burning, right?
Right.
Or Prophet
Or the sun
throwing
going
stick
down and
into the sea.
yes.
Yeah. So, right. And so the status of what we will call today natural causality, or natural laws, claims about natural laws, comes in, definitely in the picture there, right? Now it gets actually a very complicated discussion, much more complicated than people, usually writing about it now.
Yes.
Get into. So, but the key points are that Ghazali did believe in the possibility of demonstrative science, right? In the Incoherence of the Philosophers, he gives as an example the philosopher's explanation of the lunar eclipse, right?
That's right. Yes.
And he says that this explanation is based on demonstrative proofs, and that nobody should seek to oppose that for theological reasons.
Yes.
To do so would only show that religion is fallacious, right? Because these things are proven.
Yes.
If people understand the proof, they will know that it's absolutely certain, right?
Yes, because he says that the people who are trying to bring in these cobwebs, these misconceptions, are the biggest enemies of the religion, which is Islam we are talking about.
Right, exactly. So he wants to be very precise. He wants to defend the possibility of miracles that are described in the Quran, right? And he does so, by way of careful thinking about what is involved in, and this is how I put it, careful thinking about what is involved in understanding nature as an ordered system, right? Which is also an act of God, right? And an act of God who acts by will, right? Voluntarily by will rather than necessity. Yeah. So to understand Ghazali's position, we have to realize that he's looking for a way to explain nature, or he's giving us a philosophy of nature which is compatible with all of these things, right? And on the surface, it may seem to be impossible that those can all be compatible, right? So if for example, if there are no necessary connections between, as he says, observed causes and effects, right? Then how can it be the case that demonstrative science is possible? Because at least for the philosopher, right, they take the Aristotelian view that demonstrative science depends on identifying, right, the necessary causal relations between observable things. Yeah. And so if there are no such things, how can such science be possible? Yeah.
Right.
So it's well, I couldn't really explain it all here because I wrote a book about it, so I can't just read you the book on the podcast. Yeah. But in any case,
yes,
it's not to say that Ghazali's, and my point here is, when I say this, is not that Ghazali's, correct about this, right? Rather, it's just that to show that the debate is in fact a very rational and philosophical debate between all the sides, right? They all have actually, and in fact, I'll say they all three have what we would call philosophical as well as what we would call religious motivations, in what they say, right? And to understand and appreciate their points of view, you have to sort of, you have to realize that. And to realize that, we have to move away from the dichotomy that the superimposition of the Western experience gives us and has been used to sort of present to us this history
Yes.
by Orientalist writers who have presented in this way, so that we have to say, okay, one side here is religiously motivated, the other side's philosophically and scientifically motivated,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, as an example, you are going to ask me, and I'll just jump in with that because I think that's one of your questions about how this can, what we can learn about science and how to deal with science today. I think that was your question now, right? What I would say is just that you can see that Ibn Rushd has actually religious motivations, and the fact that he continually comes down against Ghazali in order to defend the orderliness of nature and the possibility of scientific knowledge of nature, right? Because for him, that reflects on God, right? The idea that the universe is created by a wise, intelligent creator,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, uh, entails that universe is ordered in a perfectly ordered way, that there should be a reason for everything, right?
Right.
And then we can discover that reason, right? And that's very religious motivation, really, when you think about it. Ghazali oftentimes is the one who's pushing the skeptical position. Maybe there's not a reason for everything, or maybe not everything. Maybe we can't ascertain the reason for everything, and that in a way, many would argue, and I think I would argue, that's actually a side of a scientific perspective. You have to actually be ready to question your presuppositions, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to question the limits of what you think you know, right?
Right.
And one of the things that Ibn Rushd is really fixated on, or let's say he's invested in, is the idea that, at least the idea that a comprehensive scientific knowledge of creation is possible.
Mm-hmm.
But even, I think, a notion that is actual. He wants to think that basically Aristotle has figured it all out,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Right.
Ghazali is always pointing out that, look, there are things, beyond our
Mm-hmm.
experience. There are things we haven't observed,
Mm-hmm.
right? What we know about the universe is really just a small section.
Mm-hmm.
And so, no way, on the basis of what we have experienced and what we do think we know, that we can rule out things that are very different from what we understand.
Mm-hmm.
And so this requires a bit of a self-critique and, an awareness of the limits of our knowledge, which I would argue is part of the scientific mindset. So if we, as Muslims, wanted to sort of kind of come up with a model of a scientific mind, which is not simply an imposition of a Western model, which we then sort of accept through this kind of colonial imposition, then we could actually look at this aspect of Ibn Rushd and this aspect of Ghazali, because I think they are both crucial for a scientific mind. One is,
Mm-hmm.
the sort of, in a sense, faith
Mm-hmm.
that objective scientific knowledge about the universe is possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that Ibn Rushd has,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, this critical, skeptical
Mm-hmm.
position toward any version of that objective truth that we might actually at any point in time think we have, right? So in this interesting way, the roles are kind of reversed, whereas Ghazali is a bit the more skeptical one, and Ibn Rushd is the one that has faith in the ability of the human intellect, but that actually translates into faith that the universe is a perfect order, which is in fact the theological position. And I think, but without taking a side between the two, what I aim to do in the book is to sort of illustrate, through looking closely at both of their arguments, the value of each point of view, and hopefully, instead of Muslims dividing over this, we can see it as part of our heritage and use the debate between them to sort of build on a more free, like a more sovereign Islamic view of science and the world. Yeah, to sort of
Absolutely, yes. And I really like your take on Imam Ghazali, because traditionally the overview is that he shunned all the the Greek philosophers, the ideas which had crept into Islamic philosophy, and during his later uh, 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 later years in his life, he had shifted to spirituality. But this is a very interesting take which you have brought in. But now let me ask you: many Islamic scholars are purists. We have to be practical in this world, and
Mhm.
they have some ideas of totally writing off Western philosophy and
Mhm.
superimposing Islamic philosophy. What do you have to say about this? What do you tell such people?
I'm not sure. Maybe I'm one of those purists.
You're not. I'm not
So,
saying that you
so,
are the purist.
so,
Yeah,
well, I mean, it depends what you mean. If by discarding Western philosophy, you mean just like ignoring it or not paying attention to it,
that's right.
then I would disagree, and I would think there is value to understanding Western philosophy simply because Western philosophy is part of, you know, what has established this sort of order that we're all living
Hmm.
under, this hegemonic Western order and Western way of thinking, right?
Right.
So understanding Western philosophy is necessary to sort of make explicit what's only implicit there, to reveal the unwritten rules and the stated assumptions which we are all kind of locked in. That's part
Mhm.
of what's necessary for us to decolonize ourselves and sort of
Right.
free the Muslim. So, I would be against discarding Western philosophy if that's what it means, right? I
Right.
would be for discarding Western philosophy if it means, looking at it critically and not feeling any arbitrary or unjustified obligation to take it more seriously than it needs to be taken,
Hmm.
and not to give it that sort of sense of authority that
Hmm.
Western philosophy we somehow, for some reason, have to be in abeyance to, or to judge ourselves by, or to accept as the standard by which we evaluate things and especially our own
Right.
thoughts. So in that sense, I'm kind of a purist because I'm a Muslim, right? So I don't think that there's any compromise between Tawheed and atheism, right? I mean, God either exists or he doesn't exist, right? So, and if God, on the premise that God exists and created everything, well, a system of thinking based on that is not going to be compatible with a system of thinking based on, atheism and the non-existence of God and the ultimate accident of everything that exists, right? There's not going to be any, right? So, and basically Western thought really is premised on that ultimately.
Yes.
So I think in a sense that has to be discarded by any Muslim. Yeah.
I get what you're saying. And just one last
That doesn't
question.
mean that there's nothing of value at all. I mean, for sure, there's insights that can be had, and that's what Ghazali actually talked about.
Absolutely.
He talked about learning from, Greek philosophers and Aristotle. I wouldn't consider Aristotle and Plato and them as atheists in the same sense that the Western
Yes.
thought really is.
Yes.
But there are theological problems that definitely Muslims have with the Greek sort of philosophy there. And Ghazali talked about stealing something useful from the thief's pack. That if it's
Right.
useful, you can take it and have to take it all,
Yes.
and that we can do with Western ideas as well.
Sure. One last question because I'm running out of time completely. How do you
Okay.
balance both worlds? How do you balance the inspiration we get from great thinkers like Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and the world we live in, which certainly
Mhm.
has influences from different
Mhm.
civilization. We have the Chinese civilization, we have the Indian civilization, we have so many
Mhm.
civilizations which we can learn from. So how do we bring out this confluence?
Right. Well, first thing I think I would say is that a balance only makes sense between two things that are mutually exclusive,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, I mean, I put things in a balance, and the
Sure.
more I put on one side, the less it's going to be on the other. So they have to be mutually exclusive.
Sure.
So if we talk about the balance between Islam and modern world,
Hmm.
then we're assuming that Islam and the modern world are mutually exclusive, in the
Hmm.
sense that to balance them, I have to to be a little bit more modern, I have to be less Muslim. In order to be
Hmm.
more Muslim, I have to be less modern. So I have to do this balance,
Hmm.
right? So if it's possible, for example, if it's logically possible to be fully Muslim and fully modern, then there's no sense in talking about balance, right? As soon as we talk about balance, we are actually already presuming that that they're mutually exclusive and in contradiction. And if they are mutually exclusive and in contradiction, if that's the case, then there's no way that a Muslim can talk about balancing, because again, you can't balance between Tawheed and Kufr, right? You're either Muslim or you're not. There's no like, I'm balanced, I'm half Muslim, half not Muslim. It's not going to work, right? So that's just how that's just maybe semantic. Possibly it's important to think that, though, to make sure we understand in that way. But when we talk about learning from others, right?
Yes.
Then I think it's a different thing, and we have to distinguish between. This is where something that the philosopher have brought into the Islamic tradition, I think, is useful, very useful, and important. The difference between the imagination and reason, right? Now we can distinguish between the actual truths of Islam, right? The actual principles, what the essence of Islam is, right? And then we have to look at, the cultural expression of those principles, right? So philosopher would put this by saying that, when we're talking about the principles of something, we're actually at the level of reason, right? But the cultural expression of something is at the level of the waham, right? The imagination, So, for example, when we talk about Chinese civilization, like any culture, we're talking about something imaginal. There are Chinese Muslims, right? These Chinese Muslims are Muslims. What makes them Muslim? Well, what makes them Muslim is, not anything to do with their being less Chinese, but it has to do with the principles of Islam.
Thank you, Dr. Moad. Thank you for joining us. This interaction was truly fascinating, and we really like your book, and I hope others can also benefit from it. Thank you very much. In today's world, to think that Muslims must only believe in Islamic philosophy and shelve all other streams of thought coming from rest of the great civilizations would be impractical. We need to interpret Islamic beliefs in a manner that we survive in today's world while keeping the religion relevant. That's all we have this week. We'll be back soon with another interesting episode. Till then, goodbye from the Matrix team.